Sometimes a man inherits more than just property. He inherits the chance to prove every doubter wrong. When Jake Hartwell rode into Pine Ridge to claim his dead uncle's cabin, the whole town treated him like yesterday's news. The cabin was a wreck, rotting wood, sagging roof, broken windows. Everyone laughed and said Jake got stuck with worthless junk, but Jake knew something they didn't. His uncle wasn't the simple hermit folks thought he was. As Jake started fixing up the old place, he found things hidden beneath the floorboards, things that would make him rich beyond his wildest dreams. But when word got out about his discovery, dangerous men came looking for what Jake found. What Jake discovered in that cabin would either make him the richest man in Colorado or get him killed trying to keep it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Hartwell had spent 43 years learning to read the mountains like other men read newspapers. Every weathered ridge told a story, every game trail spoke of seasons past, and every stand of timber whispered secrets to those patient enough to listen. But the story unfolding before him now, as he sat astride his aging sorrel mare on the dusty main street of Pine Ridge, Colorado, was one he couldn't quite decipher yet. The town hadn't changed much in the 15 years since he'd last ridden through. Same false front buildings leaning against each other like tired old men, same rutted street that turned to soup when it rained, same suspicious stares from folks who'd rather deal with familiar problems than unfamiliar strangers. Pine Ridge had maybe 300 souls on a good day, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business, and newcomers were about as welcome as a skunk at a church social. Jake dismounted slowly, his joints protesting after the two-day ride down from his cabin in the high country. At 6'2", he still cut an imposing figure despite the grey threading through his dark beard and the lines carved around his eyes by 4 decades of mountain weather. His buckskin jacket bore the careful repairs of a man who valued function over fashion, and his boots had walked more miles of wilderness than most men saw in a lifetime. The lawyer's office sat between Murphy's Saloon and Caldwell's General Store, a narrow building that looked like it had been squeezed into place as an afterthought. Jake tied his horse to the hitching rail and paused, studying the hand-painted sign that read, "Ezra Blackwood, Attorney at Law," in faded letters. Strange how a man could live his whole life in the mountains and still end up tangled in legal documents and inheritance disputes. The bell above the door announced his arrival with a rusty clang. Ezra Blackwood looked up from behind a desk piled high with papers, his wire-rimmed spectacles perched on the end of a nose that had seen too many years and too much whiskey. He was a thin, nervous man who reminded Jake of a startled rabbit. "Mr. Hartwell, I presume?" Blackwood's voice carried the educated accent of someone who'd come west with bigger dreams than Pine Ridge could fulfill. "I've been expecting you ever since I received word about your uncle's passing. Please have a seat." Jake settled into the wooden chair across from the desk, his hat balanced on his knee. "I got your letter about Uncle Henry's will. Can't say I was expecting to inherit anything from him. We weren't exactly what you'd call close. That was putting it mildly. Henry Hartwell had been the family's black sheep, the brother who disappeared into the Colorado wilderness 30 years ago, and barely stayed in touch. Jake remembered him as a restless, secretive man who'd visit the family ranch maybe once every few years, usually needing money and always carrying stories that seemed too wild to believe. Blackwood shuffled through his papers and produced a formal-looking document sealed with wax. "Your uncle was quite specific in his instructions. The property known as the Hartwell cabin, along with 40 acres of surrounding land, passes to you upon his death. He also left you this." The lawyer handed Jake a sealed envelope with his name written in Henry's familiar, spidery handwriting. Jake studied the envelope, feeling its weight. Something more than paper in there. "What exactly am I inheriting? I remember Uncle Henry's place being pretty rough when I saw it as a boy." "Well," Blackwood cleared his throat diplomatically, "time hasn't been kind to the structure. The roof needs extensive work. Most of the windows are broken, and I'm told the foundation has some issues. The land itself might have some value for timber, but honestly, Mr. Hartwell, you'd be within your rights to simply abandon the property. The back taxes alone amount to—" "I'll pay the taxes," Jake interrupted. Something in the lawyer's eagerness to discourage him raised his hackles. In his experience, when men tried to talk you out of something that was rightfully yours, it usually meant they knew something you didn't. After handling the paperwork and paying the required fees, which took a significant bite out of his modest savings, Jake stepped back onto the street. The afternoon sun slanted across the wooden sidewalks, and he could hear the sounds of daily life resuming around him. A blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil, children played in the dusty gaps between buildings, and somewhere a woman called her husband to supper. But Jake also noticed the way conversations stopped when he passed, the way eyes followed his movements. News traveled fast in a small town, and word of Henry Hartwell's inheritance was already making the rounds. "You must be Jake Hartwell." The voice belonged to a woman emerging from the general store, her arms full of wrapped packages. She was maybe 50, with prematurely grey hair pinned back in a practical bun, and kind eyes that spoke of someone who'd seen both joy and sorrow. "I'm Martha Caldwell. I knew your uncle." Jake touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, I take it you're about the only one in town who did." Martha's smile was sad, but genuine. "Henry was a good man, just very private. He used to come into my store maybe once a month for supplies. Never said much, but he was always polite, paid his bills in cash." She paused, studying Jake's face. "You look like him, you know. Same eyes. Did he ever talk about his property?" "The cabin? Only to say it suited him fine." Martha glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Word of advice, Mr. Hartwell. There's been talk in town about that property since Henry passed. Some folks think it might be worth more than it appears. You might want to be careful who you trust." Before Jake could ask what she meant, Martha had gathered her packages and headed down the street, leaving him with more questions than answers. Jake spent the night at Pine Ridge's only boarding house, a clean but sparse establishment run by a stern widow named Mrs. Patterson. The room cost him 50 cents and came with a lumpy mattress and a view of the alley. But it was better than camping in the open with storm clouds building over the mountains. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows and wood smoke rising straight up from chimneys in the still air. Jake saddled his horse and loaded his few possessions, including the tools he'd need for basic repairs. The ride to Henry's property took him northwest of town, following a rutted wagon track that hadn't seen much use in recent years. The mountains rose around him like ancient guardians, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Aspen groves shimmered gold and orange in the morning light, and somewhere a hawk cried its hunting call. This was the country Jake understood, where a man's worth was measured by his ability to survive and thrive, not by the opinions of others. The cabin sat in a small clearing beside a creek that would run strong with snowmelt come spring. But Martha's warnings hadn't prepared Jake for just how far the place had deteriorated. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, held up more by habit than structural integrity. Half the windows were broken, their glass scattered in the weeds. The front porch listed to one side like a ship taking on water. Jake dismounted and stood looking at his inheritance, hands on his hips. He'd seen plenty of abandoned buildings in his years in the mountains, places where dreams had died and hopes had been buried under snow and neglect. But something about this place felt different. Despite its sorry condition, the cabin had been built by someone who knew what he was doing. The foundation stones were carefully fitted, the walls were solid logs chinked with skill, and the positioning caught both morning sun and afternoon shade. He walked a slow circle around the building, reading the signs like tracks in snow. Henry had definitely been living here recently. There were paths worn in the grass, a woodpile under a lean-to shelter, and a well with a sturdy rope and bucket. But there were other signs too, places where the earth had been disturbed and carefully smoothed over, scratches on trees that might have been boundary markers, And something else, a feeling that someone had been watching this place, studying it. Jake pushed open the cabin door, which hung crooked on leather hinges. The interior was a study in contradictions. The main room was sparse and functional, with a stone fireplace, a rough table and chairs, and shelves lined with basic supplies. But there were also details that spoke of education and refinement. Books, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, a writing desk with good paper and ink, and maps of the surrounding area marked with symbols Jake couldn't immediately understand. It was while examining one of these maps that Jake found Henry's final gift. Tucked between the pages was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by handling. Jake opened it carefully and immediately recognized his uncle's handwriting. Though the entries were coded in a system of numbers and symbols that meant nothing to him at first glance, but the last entry, dated just 2 weeks before Henry's death, was written in plain English. "If you're reading this, nephew, then I'm gone. And you're probably wondering what kind of mess I've left you. The answer is bigger than you think, and more dangerous. Trust no one in town except Martha Caldwell. The others have been watching me, waiting for their chance. What they don't know is that I've been watching them too, and I've made provisions. Look beneath the hearthstone when you're ready. But be careful, Jake. Some secrets are worth killing for." Jake sat back in the creaky chair, the journal heavy in his hands. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose window frames and sending leaves skittering across the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked like a gunshot, or maybe it really was a gunshot. He walked to the fireplace and knelt beside the hearth, running his fingers along the edge of the large, flat stone that served as the base. It took some searching, but he finally found what he was looking for, a stone that moved slightly when pressed. Using his knife blade as a lever, Jake pried up the hearthstone. Beneath it was a cavity lined with oiled canvas. Inside the canvas was a collection of items that made Jake's pulse quicken. A leather pouch heavy with gold nuggets, more maps with detailed markings, and a letter addressed to him in Henry's careful script. Jake unfolded the letter and read, "Jake, if you've found this, then you're smarter than I gave you credit for, and maybe tough enough for what's coming. I know we weren't close, but you're the only family I trust with this secret. I've been prospecting these mountains for 25 years, and I've found more gold than most men see in a lifetime. But I've also found something else. Greed makes men dangerous, and there are people in Pine Ridge who would kill for what I've discovered. I'm leaving you everything because you're the only one who might. Be strong enough to keep it safe and smart enough to use it right. But understand this, the moment you start following these maps, you'll be walking into a war that's been brewing for years. Some of the most respected men in town are nothing more than claim jumpers and thieves, and they're not going to let an outsider waltz in and take what they've been planning to steal. Watch your back. Trust your instincts, and remember that in the mountains, patience is often the difference between living and dying. Your uncle, Henry Hartwell P.S. Martha Caldwell is the only person in town who can't be bought. If you need an ally, she's the one." Jake sat back on his heels, staring at the gold nuggets glinting in the afternoon light streaming through the broken windows. Each one was worth more than he made in a month of trapping and guiding, and there had to be 20 or 30 of them in the pouch. But it wasn't the immediate wealth that caught his attention. It was the implications. If Henry had been finding this much gold regularly, then there was a source somewhere nearby, and if the wrong people knew about it, then Jake had just inherited more than a run-down cabin and 40 acres of mountain land. He had inherited a target painted squarely on his back. Jake spent the rest of that first day making the cabin habitable enough for a night's stay. He patched the worst holes in the roof with canvas from his saddlebags, swept out the debris that had accumulated over the winter, and got a fire going in the stone fireplace. As darkness settled over the mountains, he sat studying Henry's journal. By firelight, trying to decode the symbols and numbers that filled page after page. The entries went back nearly 3 decades, but it wasn't until Jake started looking for patterns that the code began to make sense. Numbers corresponded to compass directions, symbols marked different types of terrain, and small sketches indicated landmarks. What emerged was a detailed map of Henry's activities, not just around the cabin, but throughout the surrounding mountains. Jake traced one particular route with his finger, following it from the cabin north along the creek, then up a ridge to what Henry had marked with a symbol that looked like a star inside a circle. The entry beside it read 3/7/15-22, and then a symbol that appeared throughout the journal like a signature. By morning, Jake had worked out enough of the code to realize that Henry hadn't just been a hermit living off the land. He'd been conducting a systematic survey of the entire area, marking locations with a precision that spoke of serious prospecting knowledge. The man had been looking for something specific, and based on the gold nuggets hidden under the hearth, he'd found it. Jake saddled his horse early, while frost still silvered the grass and his breath steamed in the cold air. Following Henry's coded directions, he rode north along the creek until he reached a game trail that switchbacked up the ridge. The country was rough, the kind of terrain that would break a horse's leg if you weren't careful, but Jake had been riding mountain trails since before he could properly tie his boots. The trail led to a shelf of rock overlooking the valley, and there Jake found what Henry had marked with the star symbol. At first glance, it looked like just another outcropping of granite and quartz, but when Jake dismounted and examined it more closely, he could see where someone had been chipping away at the rock face with careful, methodical strikes. And there, glinting in a vein of quartz that ran through the granite like a golden thread, was more gold than Jake had ever seen in one place. He knelt beside the outcropping, running his fingers along the vein. It was maybe 3 inches wide and disappeared into the rock in both directions. Henry had been working it carefully, taking only small amounts and always covering his tracks afterward. But the vein itself looked like it might run for yards, maybe even hundreds of yards through the mountain. Jake sat back on his heels, understanding dawning like sunrise over the peaks. This wasn't just a lucky find. This was a major gold deposit, the kind that could make a man wealthy beyond imagining. And Henry had been working it alone for years, taking just enough to live comfortably while keeping the main source secret. The sound of voices carried on the morning air, echoing off the rock walls in a way that made it impossible to tell exactly where they were coming from. Jake led his horse quickly behind a screen of pine trees and crouched low, listening. Been up here before, I tell you. Old Henry had something going on, and it wasn't just trapping. The voice was rough, with the accent of someone who'd spent time in mining camps. Keep your voice down, you fool. This second voice was more educated, more controlled. We don't know if anyone else is around. Jake eased forward until he could see through the branches. 3 men on horseback were working their way up the trail he'd just followed. The leader was a big man with a black beard and expensive boots. Not the kind of gear you wore for casual riding in rough country. The other 2 looked like hired muscle, the sort of men who were handy with guns and not particular about how they used them. This is the place Henry marked on that map we found in his belongings, the leader said, dismounting near the gold-bearing outcrop. He was definitely working this site. Look at these tool marks. Jake's blood ran cold. Henry had hidden maps and gold under the hearth, but apparently he'd kept other records somewhere else, records that had fallen into the wrong hands when he died. So where's the gold? One of the other men asked. If this site was so valuable, where's Henry's stash? Probably hidden back at that cabin, the leader replied. That's why we need to move fast, before his nephew figures out what he's inherited. A mountain man might be tough, but he's just one man, and he doesn't know what he's dealing with. Jake watched them examine the outcrop, noting how they handled themselves. These weren't casual opportunists. They moved with the confidence of men who'd done this kind of work before. Claim jumpers, probably, or worse. The kind of men who made their living taking what other people had worked to find. After maybe 20 minutes, the three men mounted up and headed back down the trail. Jake waited until he was sure they were gone before emerging from his hiding place. He spent another hour carefully examining the site, memorizing every detail and trying to understand how much gold might be there. Henry's journal had mentioned the locations marked with different symbols. If this was just one of several sites, then the inheritance was even more valuable and more dangerous than Jake had realized. The ride back to the cabin gave him time to think. The men he'd observed knew about Henry's activities. They had maps or other records, and they were planning to move against him soon. Worse, they seemed to think he was just a simple mountain man who wouldn't be able to defend himself. They were wrong about that. Jake had survived 4 decades in country that killed careless men, and he'd learned long ago that sometimes survival meant fighting back harder than the other fellow was willing to fight. But first, he needed to know exactly what he was protecting. Back at the cabin, Jake spread out all of Henry's materials on the rough table, the journal, the maps, the letter, and now his own observations from the morning's ride. Working systematically, he began to decode more of Henry's records, cross-referencing symbols and numbers until a larger picture emerged. Henry had been working at least 5 different sites scattered across the mountains within a day's ride of the cabin. Each site was marked with a different symbol, and each had yielded significant amounts of gold over the years. The star site was just the beginning. More importantly, Henry had been documenting something else in his journal, the activities of the men who were watching him. Names, dates, overheard conversations, a pattern of surveillance and planning that had been going on for months before Henry's death. One name appeared repeatedly: Sheriff Coleman. According to Henry's notes, Coleman had been asking questions around town about Henry's activities, supposedly as part of his official duties, but actually gathering intelligence for someone else. Another name was Buck Morrison, who apparently owned the largest ranch in the area and had been trying to buy up mineral rights throughout the mountains. Henry's notes suggested Morrison had been using intimidation and legal pressure to force small landowners to sell cheap. But the most disturbing entry was from just 3 weeks before Henry's death. Coleman and Morrison met with strangers at the old mine shaft. 3 men, well-armed, asking specific questions about my property. I think they're planning to move soon. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Jake set down the journal and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful mountain landscape. Somewhere out there, men were planning to steal everything Henry had worked for. They thought they were dealing with a simple inheritance dispute, something they could handle with intimidation or legal maneuvering. But they didn't understand what they were really facing. Jake had learned his lessons in country where mistakes meant death, where patience and planning mattered more than quick decisions and loud talk. He'd been hunted before, by bears and mountain cats and men who thought they were tougher than the wilderness. None of them had succeeded in bringing him down. Jake returned to the table and began making his own notes, cross-referencing Henry's observations with his own knowledge of the terrain. If these men wanted a war over Henry's legacy, then they were going to get one. But it would be fought on Jake's terms, in country he understood, using rules they'd never learned. As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake made his decision. He wasn't going to run, and he wasn't going to sell. Henry had trusted him with this inheritance, and Jake intended to prove that trust hadn't been misplaced. But first, he needed to know exactly who his enemies were and what they were planning. Tomorrow, he'd ride back to Pine Ridge and start asking the right questions. Martha Caldwell had warned him to be careful who he trusted, but she'd also hinted that she knew more than she'd said. It was time to find out just how much Martha really knew about the conspiracy that had been brewing around Henry's secret. Jake rode into Pine Ridge the next morning with Henry's correspondence bundle tucked safely in his saddlebags. The bundle contained letters Henry had received over the past year, along with copies of his replies, a careful record that painted a disturbing picture of escalating pressure and veiled threats. The general store was busy with the morning trade. When Jake pushed through the door, Martha Caldwell looked up from where she was measuring out flour for an elderly woman, and Jake caught something in her expression. Relief, maybe, or recognition of a shared burden. "Mrs. Caldwell," Jake said, touching his hat brim, "might I have a word when you're free?" "Of course, Mr. Hartwell. Let me finish with Mrs. Henderson here." Martha completed the transaction with practiced efficiency, but Jake noticed how her eyes kept drifting to the windows, as if she expected to see someone watching. When the store emptied, Martha turned the sign on the door to closed and led Jake to the back room where she kept her accounts and inventory. It was a small, tidy space that smelled of coffee and ledger ink. "I was hoping you'd come back," Martha said, settling into a chair behind her desk. "How did you find Henry's place?" "About what you'd expect from a building that's been neglected for months. But I found some things that make me think Henry's death wasn't as natural as folks believed." Jake pulled out one of Henry's letters and handed it to Martha. "Did you know he was being watched?" Martha read the letter carefully, her face growing pale. "I suspected something was wrong. Henry was always cautious, but in the last few months before he died, he seemed genuinely frightened. He'd come into town only when necessary, and he always checked the street before entering my store." "This letter mentions specific threats," Jake said. "Someone named Morrison was pressuring him to sell his property, and Sheriff Coleman was asking questions that went beyond normal law enforcement. Buck Morrison owns the Circle M Ranch, biggest spread in the county. He's been buying up land and mineral rights for years, usually at prices well below market value." Martha's voice carried years of accumulated resentment. "The man has a way of making offers that people find hard to refuse." "What kind of offers?" "Going to where your barn might burn down if you say no, or your cattle might wander off. Sheriff Coleman always investigates these incidents very thoroughly, but somehow never finds any evidence of wrongdoing." Jake studied Martha's face, reading the carefully controlled anger there. "You've had dealings with Morrison yourself. He wanted to buy my building last year. When I refused, I had a series of unfortunate accidents. Broken windows, spoiled merchandise, customers who suddenly decided to do their shopping elsewhere." Martha stood and walked to the window, peering through the curtains. "The accidents stopped when I made it clear I was keeping detailed records of everything and sending copies to my nephew in Denver." "Your nephew?" "Federal Marshal Morrison doesn't know that, but he knows I have connections outside Pine Ridge. That's probably the only reason I'm still in business." Jake was beginning to understand the scope of what Henry had been facing. "How many people in town are involved with Morrison?" "Hard to say. Some are willing partners, others are just scared. Morrison has a way of making people dependent on him. Loans. When times are hard, help with legal problems, protection from various troubles. Before you know it, you owe him more than you can repay. And Sheriff Coleman?" Martha's expression darkened. "Coleman came to town about 5 years ago with impressive credentials and a story about wanting to settle down somewhere quiet. What he really wanted was a position where he could operate without much oversight from territorial authorities." Jake absorbed this information, mentally cataloguing the players in the conspiracy Henry had uncovered. "Mrs. Caldwell, I need to ask you something directly. Henry left me maps and records that suggest he'd found something valuable on his property. If that's true, and if Morrison and Coleman know about it, then I'm walking into more trouble than I can handle alone." Martha returned to her chair and leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Jake, may I call you Jake? Henry found gold. Not just a few nuggets, but a significant deposit. He was very careful about it, only taking small amounts and never spending enough to attract attention. But somehow, word got out. How do you know all this? Because Henry trusted me with some of his secrets. He knew he was being watched, and he was afraid something might happen to him. So he gave me copies of his most important maps and asked Me to hold them until someone came who could be trusted with the truth. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. You have copies of Henry's maps? Hidden where Morrison and his people will never find them. Henry was very specific about who should receive them. Someone from his family who had the backbone to stand up to bullies and the sense to use the information wisely. Why didn't you contact me sooner? Because I needed to see what kind of man you were. If you turned out to be another fortune hunter or someone who could be easily intimidated, I would have let sleeping dogs lie. But watching how you've handled yourself these past few days, I think Henry chose his heir well. Martha stood and walked to a heavy safe in the corner of the room. After working the combination, she withdrew a leather portfolio and set it on the desk between them. These are Henry's backup records, maps, assay reports, correspondence with mining engineers in Denver, everything you need to understand what you've inherited. Jake opened the portfolio with careful hands. The first document was an assay report from a mining firm in Denver, dated 8 months before Henry's death. The numbers made Jake whistle low under his breath. This says Henry's samples contain gold worth $12 per ton of ore. That's rich enough to justify a major mining operation. Keep reading, Martha said quietly. The next document was a survey report estimating the size of the deposit Henry had discovered. According to the surveyor's calculations, the gold-bearing veins might extend for miles through the mountain, potentially yielding hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of ore. Sweet Lord, Jake breathed. Henry was sitting on a fortune that Morrison and Coleman decided belonged to them. They've been planning to claim Henry's property ever since they learned about the gold. When Henry died suddenly of what Doc Peterson called a heart attack, they figured the inheritance would go to some distant relative who could be bought off or scared away. Jake looked up from the papers. They didn't count on the relative being someone who knows how to fight back. No, they didn't. But Jake, you need to understand what you're up against. Morrison has money, political connections, and men who aren't particular about how they earn their wages. Coleman has the law on his side, at least officially, and they've had months to plan their move. What exactly are they planning? From what I've been able to piece together, they intend to force you to sell the property for a fraction of its value. If you refuse, they'll find a legal excuse to seize it. Unpaid taxes, violations of mining laws, anything that will hold up long enough for them to strip out the gold and disappear. Jake closed the portfolio and sat back in his chair. The magnitude of Henry's legacy was staggering, but so was the danger that came with it. Men had killed for far less than what lay buried in those mountains. Mrs. Caldwell, you've taken a considerable risk helping me like this. Why? Martha's smile was sad, but determined. Because Henry was a good man who deserved better than being murdered for his life's work, and because bullies like Morrison only get worse if nobody stands up to them. This town has been living in fear for too long. Jake studied the woman across. From him, seeing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. Henry had chosen his allies well. What do you suggest we do next? We need to move carefully. Morrison doesn't know yet that you found Henry's records, but he won't wait much longer before making his move. My guess is he'll start with an offer to buy your property. When you refuse, things will escalate quickly. How quickly? Days, maybe a week at most. Once Morrison commits to a course of action, he doesn't like to waste time. Jake nodded slowly. He'd faced dangerous situations before, but never anything quite like this. In the wilderness, threats were usually straightforward. Weather, wild. Animals, terrain. Human enemies were more complex, requiring different strategies and different kinds of patience. But the principles were the same. Understand your enemy, use your advantages, and never let them choose the time and place of battle. I'll need to study these maps tonight and figure out exactly what I'm protecting, Jake said. After that, I think it's time to let Morrison know. He's dealing with someone who won't scare easily. That evening, Jake spread Martha's documents across Henry's table and began to understand the true scope of his uncle's discovery. The assayer's receipt showed not just one significant find, but evidence of multiple gold-bearing veins scattered across the property. Henry had been methodically mapping an entire network of deposits, some connected underground, others standing, alone. But what caught Jake's attention wasn't just the gold. It was the dates on Henry's trips to Denver. According to the receipts, Henry had been making regular visits to assay offices and mining supply companies for over 2 years. He'd been planning something bigger than simple prospecting. A knock at the cabin door interrupted Jake's concentration. He moved quietly to the window and peered out, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt revolver. 3 men stood on his porch, Sheriff Coleman and 2 deputies Jake didn't recognize. "Mr. Hartwell?" Coleman's voice carried the false friendliness of a man conducting official business. "Sheriff Coleman, mind if we come in and have a word?" Jake opened the door but didn't step aside to let them enter. Coleman was a big man with pale eyes and a badge that looked like it had been polished. Recently, his deputies flanked him like well-trained dogs, their hands resting casually near their weapons. "Sheriff, what can I do for you?" "Just wanted to welcome you to the area and see how you're settling in. Heard you inherited this place from your uncle. Henry was a good man, kept to himself, never caused any trouble." "That's what I've heard." Jake kept his voice neutral, watching for tells in the sheriff's manner. "Course, inheriting property brings responsibilities, tax assessments, legal requirements, that sort of thing. Wouldn't want you to run into any problems through ignorance of local regulations." One of the deputies shifted slightly, and Jake caught the glint of metal beneath his coat. These men hadn't come for a social visit. "I appreciate the concern, Sheriff. Is there something specific I should know about?" Coleman's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, there's been some talk about your uncle's activities up here. Rumors that he might have been prospecting without proper permits, the territorial mining. Laws are pretty strict about that sort of thing. Prospecting for what? Oh, just general talk. You know how people gossip in a small town. But if there were any irregularities in Henry's operations, they'd need to be sorted out before you could claim clear title to the property." Jake felt the trap closing around him. Coleman was fishing, trying to get him to admit knowledge of Henry's gold discoveries. Any admission would give them legal justification for seizing the property. "Far as I know, Uncle Henry just lived up here quietly. Didn't even own a mining pick." "Course not," Coleman agreed too quickly. "Like I said, just rumors. But you might want to consider your options carefully. Property like this can be a burden for someone not familiar with mountain living. Winters are hard, access is difficult. Man could find himself in trouble fast if he's not prepared." The threat was subtle, but clear. Jake met Coleman's stare directly. "I've been living in the mountains for 20 years, Sheriff. I reckon I can handle whatever comes." "I'm sure you can. Still, if you ever decide this place is more trouble than it's worth, there are folks in town who might be interested in taking it off your hands, save you a lot of potential headaches. I'll keep that in mind." Coleman touched his hat brim. "Good. We'll be getting along then. You have any problems up here, don't hesitate to contact my office." After the 3 men rode away, Jake barred the door and extinguished the oil lamp. Moving by moonlight, he gathered Henry's most important documents and hid them in various locations around the cabin. If Coleman came back with a search warrant, or without one, Jake wanted to make sure the evidence was protected. The next morning brought visitors of a different sort. Jake was splitting firewood when he heard horses approaching, and this time he counted at least 6 riders. He set down his axe and walked to where he could see the trail, his rifle within easy reach. The lead rider was well dressed in the manner of a successful rancher. Good boots, quality hat, horse that had cost more than most men made in a year. This would be Buck Morrison, and he'd brought enough men to make his point clear. Morrison dismounted with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. He was maybe 50, with graying hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached. His eyes, the men with him stayed mounted, arranged in a loose semicircle that blocked Jake's escape routes. "Mr. Hartwell, I presume." Buck Morrison, Circle M Ranch. I was hoping we could have a conversation about your property here. What about it? Morrison gestured expansively at the cabin and surrounding land. Beautiful country, but isolated. Hard for a single man to make. A living this far from town. I've been thinking this area might work well as a line camp for my operation, and I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. How generous? $500 cash paid today. More than enough to set you up somewhere more convenient. Jake kept his expression neutral while his mind raced. $500 was good money, but it was a fraction of what the property was worth if Morrison knew about the gold. The lowball offer confirmed that Morrison was still fishing, trying to buy the land cheap before Jake discovered its true value. That's a significant sum, Jake said carefully. Mind if I ask what you'd use the property for? Like I said, line camp. Maybe do some logging on the back 40. Nothing too ambitious. Morrison's casual tone didn't match the intensity in his eyes. I'll need some time to think about it. Morrison's smile tightened slightly. Course you will. But I should mention that opportunities like this don't stay open indefinitely. Market conditions change, you understand. What looks like a fair price today might seem overly generous tomorrow. Another threat, delivered with the polished menace of a man who'd practiced this routine many times. Jake nodded, as if he understood. Perfectly. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Morrison. I'll give it serious consideration. See that you do. Morrison remounted his horse with fluid grace. I'll be in touch in a few days to hear your decision. Wouldn't want you to miss out on a good thing. After Morrison and his men rode away, Jake sat on his porch and thought about what he'd learned. Both Coleman and Morrison were moving faster than Martha had predicted, which suggested they were under some kind of pressure. Maybe they had partners who were getting impatient, or maybe they'd heard rumors that Jake was asking questions in town. Either way, Jake was running out of time to prepare for whatever was coming next. He needed to understand more about the gold deposits Henry had found, and he needed to find a way to protect himself against men who had the law and superior numbers on their side. But first, he needed to visit the other sites marked on Henry's maps. If he was going to fight for this inheritance, he needed to know exactly what he was fighting for. Jake spent the rest of the day preparing for an extended survey of Henry's claims. He loaded his saddlebags with supplies for several days. In the wilderness, cleaned and oiled his weapons, and studied the maps until he could navigate Henry's routes from memory. As sunset painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Jake made his final preparations. Tomorrow, he would begin following the trail Henry had blazed through these mountains, uncovering the secrets that had cost his uncle his life. And somewhere, out there, Jake knew, Morrison's men would be watching for their chance to strike. Jake discovered the surveyor's stakes on his third day of following Henry's maps. Hidden in a grove of aspen trees about 2 miles northeast of the cabin, the wooden markers were so weathered and overgrown that he almost missed them entirely. But once he found the first one, the pattern became clear. Henry had been conducting a professional survey of a much larger area than anyone suspected. The stakes outlined a section of land that extended well beyond the 40 acres mentioned in Henry's will. According to the territorial survey maps Jake carried, this additional territory included mineral rights that had never been officially claimed. Henry had been quietly staking out a mining claim that could legally encompass hundreds of acres of gold-bearing terrain. But the most disturbing discovery came when Jake found evidence that someone else had been examining the stakes recently. Boot prints in the soft earth, broken branches where someone had pushed through the undergrowth, and scratches on the wooden markers where metal tools had been used to examine the carved symbols. Morrison's men had been here, and they'd been thorough. Jake spent another hour searching the area and found what he was looking for. A campsite about a quarter-mile from the stakes, carefully concealed, but used recently enough that he could still smell cold ashes from a cooking fire. Whoever had been watching this location had stayed for several days, long enough to map out Henry's entire claim. The implications were troubling. Morrison wasn't just interested in buying Jake's inherited property. he was planning to seize control of Henry's entire operation, including claims that might not be legally documented yet. And if Morrison had access to territorial survey records, he might be able to challenge Henry's mining rights through official channels. Jake made careful note of the camp's location and continued following Henry's trail, working his way systematically through each site marked on the maps. What he found painted a picture of methodical, professional mining activity that had been going on for years. The second site was a streambed where Henry had been placer mining, using simple tools to separate gold from gravel washed down from the mountains. Evidence of his work was everywhere. Carefully constructed sluices, areas where the streambed had been systematically worked, and small caches where Henry had hidden equipment between visits. The third site was the most impressive, a natural cave that Henry had expanded into a proper mine shaft. The entrance was camouflaged so expertly that Jake walked past it twice before spotting the subtle signs that marked its location. Inside, the shaft extended maybe 50 feet into the mountainside, following a quartz vein that glittered with gold deposits. But again, Jake found evidence of recent visitors. Someone had been examining Henry's work with considerable expertise, taking samples and making measurements. Whoever Morrison was working with, they knew mining. It was at the fourth site that Jake finally encountered Morrison's watchers directly. He'd been following a deer trail along a ridgeline when his horse suddenly pricked its ears and snorted nervously. Jake reined in immediately, reading the signs that had kept him alive through decades of wilderness travel. Something ahead was wrong. A scent on the wind, a sound that didn't belong, an absence of the small movements that should have been there. Jake dismounted and led his horse into a thick stand of pine trees, then crept forward on foot until he could see the area Henry had marked as his most productive site. Two men sat beside a small fire, their horses picketed nearby and their rifles within easy reach. They were dressed like cowhands, but moved with the careful alertness of men who expected trouble. Jake settled into a position where he could observe without being seen, and waited. Patience was a hunter's greatest weapon, and these men were clearly waiting for something or someone. After maybe an hour, a third man arrived on horseback. Jake recognized him as one of Morrison's ranch hands, a lean, hard-faced individual who'd been with Morrison during his visit to the cabin. "Any sign of him?" the newcomer asked as he dismounted. "Not yet, but he's been here. Found fresh tracks at the cave site yesterday, and someone's been digging around the survey stakes. Boss wants to know how much he's figured out." "Hard to say. He's following Henry's routes exactly, which means he's got the old man's maps. Question is whether he understands what he's looking at." The third man spat into the fire, sending up a small hiss of steam. "Morrison thinks we're wasting time with this watching and waiting, says we should just take care of the problem directly. And Coleman says we need to be careful about appearances. Too many suspicious deaths, and the territorial authorities might start asking questions." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. These men were discussing his murder as casually as they might talk about the weather. "What's the plan then?" "Coleman's working on getting a court order to seize the property for back taxes. Once that goes through, we move in and clean out anything valuable before the nephew can object. If he tries to fight it," the man shrugged eloquently, "and if the court order doesn't work, then we go with Morrison's original plan. Accidents happen in the mountains. City folks don't understand how dangerous this country can be." Jake had heard enough. He eased backward through the trees until he was well clear of the camp, then mounted his horse and rode a wide circle around the area. But instead of heading directly back to the cabin, he took a detour that led to the old mine, workings Henry had marked on his maps as abandoned. There, hidden in a shaft that looked like it hadn't been worked in decades, Jake found Henry's insurance policy. The cash was concealed behind what looked like a natural rockfall, but when Jake examined it closely, he could see that the stones had been carefully arranged to hide a small cave. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas and leather, was everything Henry had accumulated over years of careful prospecting: gold nuggets sorted by size and purity, refined gold dust measured and weighed in, small leather pouches, raw ore samples from each of his active sites, and most importantly, official documentation that Henry had filed with territorial authorities in Denver, properly registered mining claims, assay reports, and legal correspondence that established his rights to the mineral deposits. Jake also found Henry's final letter addressed to him and dated just days before Henry's death. Jake, if you're reading this, then my precautions weren't enough and Coleman's people got to me. But I've made sure they can't steal what I've found, no matter what legal tricks they try to pull. The documents in this cache prove that I filed legitimate claims on all the significant deposits. Morrison and Coleman know about some of my sites, but they don't know about this one, and they don't know I made everything legal through proper channels. Use this information wisely. The gold is worth fighting for, but only if you can stay alive long enough to claim it legally. Trust Martha. Caldwell, she has contacts who can help. And remember that in the mountains, the man who keeps his head while others lose theirs usually walks away with everything. Your uncle, Henry. Jake sat back on his heels, understanding finally dawning. Henry hadn't just been a secretive prospector, he'd been a careful, methodical businessman who'd played a longer game than his enemies realized. All of Morrison's scheming and Coleman's legal maneuvering was based on the assumption that Henry's claims were informal and unregistered. They were wrong. But Jake also realized that having legal documents wouldn't be enough if he couldn't live long enough to present them. Morrison and Coleman had committed too much to back down now, and they had the immediate advantages of numbers, local connections, and official authority. Jake carefully repacked Henry's cache and concealed the entrance exactly as he'd found it. Then he began the ride back to the cabin, his mind working through the tactical problems he faced. He was outnumbered and outgunned, facing enemies who controlled the local legal system and had no scruples about murder. But he also had advantages they didn't know about: Henry's legal documentation, knowledge of terrain they couldn't match, and skills learned in country where weakness meant death. Most importantly, he had something they didn't expect: the patience to let them make the first mistake and the determination to make sure it was their last. Jake discovered Henry's warning system 2 days after returning from the hidden cache. What he'd initially taken for random scratches on trees and oddly positioned rocks turned out to be an elaborate network of signals designed to alert a careful observer to approaching danger. Henry had been more paranoid than Jake realized, and with good reason. The warning system covered all the approaches to the cabin and the main mining sites, using a combination of mirrors positioned to catch sunlight, tripwires connected to small bells hidden in tree branches, and even trained ravens that Henry had somehow convinced to sound specific calls when strangers approached their territory. Jake spent the morning testing the system, learning to read the subtle signs Henry had left behind. A mirror flash from the ridge meant riders on the main trail. 2 short bell chimes, followed by a long one, indicated movement near the creek crossing. And the ravens! Jake could hardly believe it, but the birds really did seem to distinguish between him and strangers, raising different alarm calls for each. It was the ravens that warned him about the first real attempt on his life. Jake was working on the cabin's roof, replacing rotted shingles with new wood he'd split from deadfall pine, when he heard the distinctive 3-core sequence that meant armed men approaching from the south. He climbed down quickly and positioned himself where he could see the trail while remaining hidden behind the cabin's stone chimney. 4 men approached on foot, moving with the careful stealth of experienced hunters. They'd left their horses well back and were armed with rifles, spreading out to surround the cabin from different angles. These weren't Morrison's usual ranch hands. They moved with military precision, and their equipment was too good for common hired guns. Jake slipped through the cabin's back door and gathered the weapons he'd prepared for this moment. Henry's old Sharp's rifle for long-range work, his own Winchester for quick shooting, and a double-barreled shotgun loaded with buckshot for close encounters. He also grabbed the leather satchel containing copies of Henry's most important documents. If these men were here to kill him, he wanted to make sure the evidence survived. The attack came just as the sun reached its zenith, eliminating most of the shadows that might have provided concealment. Jake heard the soft whistle that meant close and fire, followed immediately by rifle shots that splintered the cabin's log walls. But Jake wasn't inside anymore. Using a trick Henry had built into the cabin's design, he'd slipped out through a concealed exit that opened into a root cellar connected to a natural cave system. Henry had planned for exactly this kind of assault, creating escape routes that his enemies couldn't have anticipated. Jake emerged from the cave opening about 50 yards uphill from the cabin, positioned where he could see all 4 attackers. Without being seen himself, they were professionals, but they were operating on false assumptions about their target's capabilities. The first shot from Henry's sharps took down the man positioned behind the woodpile, the heavy bullet punching through his cover like it was paper. The boom of the big rifle echoed off the canyon walls, and Jake was already moving to a new position before the other attackers could locate his muzzle flash. The second shot came from a different angle, the Winchester's lighter crack dropping the man who'd been trying to circle around to the cabin's blind side. 2 down, 2 to go, and the survivors were beginning to realize they'd walked into a trap instead of setting one. Jake heard them calling to each other, their voices tight with the controlled fear of men who'd suddenly found themselves on the wrong end of an engagement. They were regrouping, trying to figure out where the shots were coming from and how many men they were facing. "He's got to be up in those rocks somewhere," one of them shouted. "Circle around and flush him out." But Jake was already moving again, using game trails and natural cover to stay ahead of their search. Henry had taught him well through his journals and preparations. This wasn't just about shooting straight, it was about thinking like the mountain itself, using every advantage the terrain provided. The third man died when he tried to rush Jake's last known position, charging up a steep slope that left him exposed and winded. Jake's Winchester spoke once more, and the man pitched forward into the rocks he'd been trying to reach. The last attacker was smarter and more cautious. Instead of trying to hunt Jake down, he retreated toward where they'd left their horses, moving carefully and watching his back trail. Jake could have taken the shot, but something held him back, a hunter's instinct that said sometimes it was better to let one get away with a story than to create more questions than you could answer. Jake waited until he was sure the surviving gunman was gone, then worked his way back to the cabin to assess the damage. The walls were riddled with bullet holes, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges, but the structure was still sound. More importantly, none of the shots had come close to the hiding places where Jake had concealed Henry's documents and gold. As Jake examined the bodies of the 3 dead men, he found evidence that confirmed his worst suspicions. These weren't local hired guns. They carried equipment and papers that marked them as professional killers, the kind of men who traveled from job to job without asking questions about their employers. One of them carried a letter of credit drawn on a Denver bank, payable to bearer upon completion of specified services. No names, no details, but enough money to suggest that someone was taking Jake's elimination very seriously indeed. Another had a crude map of the cabin area with positions marked for an assault, but the map was wrong in several crucial details, suggesting it had been drawn by someone who'd observed the cabin from a distance but hadn't actually explored the terrain. Henry's defensive preparations had remained secret, even from enemies who'd been watching for months. Jake dragged the bodies into a ravine about a quarter-mile from the cabin and covered them with rocks and debris. In this country, bears and other scavengers would finish the job within days, leaving no evidence for curious authorities to investigate. But as he worked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this had been a test more than a serious assassination attempt. The men had been good, but not good enough to handle someone who knew the ground and had prepared properly. Someone was learning about his capabilities, probing his defenses. The real attack would come later, when his enemies had better intelligence and more resources. That evening, Jake sat on his repaired porch and thought about what the day's events meant. Morrison and Coleman were escalating faster than he'd expected, which suggested they were under pressure from partners or superiors who wanted results quickly. The professional killers meant serious money was involved, more than a local rancher and corrupt sheriff could afford on their own. Jake opened Henry's journal to the sections he hadn't fully decoded yet, looking for clues about who else might be involved in the conspiracy. What he found made him whistle low under his breath. Henry had been tracking connections that reached all the way to territorial politics in Denver. Names of legislators, mining company executives, and federal officials who'd been asking questions about mineral rights in the area. The gold deposits weren't just valuable, they were politically important, part of a larger scheme to control mining development throughout the Colorado Territory. Jake was facing more than local corruption. He was up against a conspiracy that had tentacles reaching into the highest levels of territorial government, with resources that could field professional killers and manipulate legal proceedings from hundreds of miles away. But Henry had also left him tools to fight back. Hidden among the coded entries were contact names in Denver, federal marshals, honest judges, and newspaper editors who might be interested in a story about corruption and murder in the mining districts. The question was whether Jake could stay alive long enough to reach them with his evidence. Jake found Sheriff Coleman's badge collection 3 days after the failed assassination attempt, while following up on a detail from Henry's journal that had nagged at him. Henry had written about seeing Coleman wearing different badges at different times, always the same silver star design, but with varying inscriptions. At the time, Jake had assumed it was just Henry's paranoia showing through, but something about the observation had stuck. The discovery came by accident. Jake was exploring a cave system that Henry had marked as a secondary escape route when he found evidence of recent use. Blankets, supplies, and a strongbox hidden behind loose rocks. The box wasn't locked, and inside Jake found a collection that told a story more disturbing than anything he'd imagined. 7 sheriff's badges, each from a different county in Colorado and Wyoming. Official documents for each identity, including appointment papers and territorial warrants. And most damning of all, newspaper clippings about mysterious deaths and property seizures in each jurisdiction where Coleman had served. Sheriff James Coleman of Pine Ridge was apparently the latest identity in a long career of legal theft and murder. The man had been working his way across the territory for over a decade, setting up in small towns, identifying valuable properties, and using his official position to seize them through manufactured legal crises. When he'd extracted everything of value, he'd move on to a new town and a new identity. But the most shocking discovery was at the bottom of the strongbox, a partnership agreement signed by Coleman and Henry Hartwell, dated 2 years earlier. According to the document, Henry and Coleman had been working together, with Henry providing geological expertise and Coleman providing legal protection for their mining activities. The partnership had been quite successful, generating substantial profits that were split equally between the two men, until Henry had discovered Coleman's real background and tried to end their association. The final entry in the partnership records was a letter from Henry to Coleman, demanding dissolution of their agreement and threatening to expose Coleman's criminal history if he didn't leave Pine Ridge immediately. Coleman's response was a single line scrawled across the bottom of Henry's letter. "Partners for life means partners for life." Jake sat back on his heels, trying to process the implications. Henry hadn't been an innocent victim. He'd been Coleman's partner in an illegal mining operation. But when Henry had learned the truth about Coleman's past, he'd tried to go legitimate, filing proper claims and preparing to operate within the law. That's when Coleman had decided Henry was a liability that needed to be eliminated. But the story got worse. Hidden behind the badges and documents, Jake found Coleman's real plan for the Pine Ridge operation. Unlike his previous schemes, which had focused on quick seizures and rapid departures, Coleman intended to establish permanent control over the entire mineral-rich region. He'd been using his position as sheriff to identify and eliminate potential rivals, while building a network of corrupt officials and hired gunmen to protect his operation. Morrison wasn't Coleman's partner. He was Coleman's puppet, manipulated through a combination of blackmail and false promises. The rancher genuinely believed he was working toward legitimate business opportunities, unaware that Coleman planned to eliminate him once the gold was secured. Jake found the evidence in Coleman's correspondence files. Letters from Morrison discussing their business arrangements were filed alongside Coleman's notes about Morrison's various illegal activities: cattle rustling, claim jumping, and intimidation of homesteaders. Coleman had been building a case against Morrison while pretending to work with him, preparing to destroy the rancher when his usefulness ended. Even Martha Caldwell wasn't safe. Coleman's notes mentioned her nephew, the federal marshal, as a potential problem requiring long-term resolution. He'd been planning to eliminate Martha and her family once he'd consolidated control over the mining district. But the most disturbing revelation was Coleman's connection to territorial politics. The badge collection represented more than serial fraud. It was part of a larger conspiracy to control mineral development throughout the region. Coleman was working for unnamed partners in Denver who had the political influence to provide him with official cover and the financial resources to maintain his operations. The professional killers who'd attacked Jake weren't random hired guns. They were Coleman's regular employees, specialists who'd helped him seize control of mining properties throughout the territory. And according to Coleman's records, they were just the advance team. A larger force was being assembled to deal with what Coleman described as the Hartwell. Her problem: Jake photographed the most important documents using a camera he'd found among Henry's supplies, then carefully returned everything to the strongbox exactly as he'd found it. Coleman couldn't know his cache had been discovered, at least not yet. But as Jake prepared to leave the cave, he heard voices approaching from outside. He froze, listening to the echoes bouncing off the cave walls. Two men, moving carefully and talking in low voices. "Told you he'd been using this place. Look at all these supplies. Coleman's going to want everything moved to the new location. Can't risk having someone stumble across it." Jake pressed himself against the cave wall, hidden in the shadows, where the lamplight wouldn't reach. The voices belonged to Coleman's deputies, the same men who'd accompanied the sheriff on his official visit to Jake's cabin. "What about the mountain man? Any word on when Coleman wants us to move on him?" "Soon. The Denver people are getting impatient. They want this wrapped up before winter sets in and travel becomes difficult. Seems like a lot of trouble for one man in a played-out mine. You seen the assay reports? This isn't just about one man's claim. There's enough gold in these mountains to finance operations all over the territory. Coleman's been planning this for 3 years. The deputies began moving supplies out of the cave, working systematically to relocate Coleman's hidden base of operations. Jake remained motionless, counting the trips they made and memorizing everything he heard. After nearly 2 hours, the deputies finished their work and departed, leaving Jake alone in the now empty cave. But their conversation had provided crucial intelligence about Coleman's timeline and resources. The sheriff was planning a major operation, probably within days, and he had backing from Denver that went well beyond local corruption. Jake made his way back to the cabin through terrain he now knew as well as his own heartbeat, using Henry's warning system to ensure he wasn't being followed. But his mind was racing with the implications of what he'd discovered. Henry's death hadn't been just murder. It had been the elimination of a partner who'd become a liability. Coleman wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was a professional criminal with connections reaching into territorial government. And Jake wasn't just facing local opposition. He was up against a conspiracy that had been years in the making. But Henry had also left him one crucial advantage that Coleman didn't know about: the legal documents Jake had found in Henry's final. Cache weren't just mining claims. They were federal claims, filed directly with territorial authorities in Denver and backed by proper geological surveys. Henry had gone over Coleman's head, establishing legal ownership that even territorial politicians couldn't easily overturn. More importantly, Henry had documented everything. His journals contained detailed records of Coleman's activities, including evidence of the sheriff's real identity and his involvement in illegal mining operations across multiple counties. If Jake could get that evidence to the right people in Denver, he could bring down the entire conspiracy. The question was whether he could survive long enough to make the trip. Jake spent the evening studying maps of the routes between Pine Ridge and Denver, calculating travel times and identifying potential safe havens along the way. Coleman would expect him to stay and fight for his property, using the defensive advantages of familiar terrain. The sheriff wouldn't anticipate an offensive move that took the battle to his political patrons. But first, Jake had one more task to complete. If he was going to expose Coleman's conspiracy, he needed evidence that would convince federal authorities to take action. And he knew where to find the most damning proof of all: in Coleman's office, where the sheriff kept the records of his current operation. Breaking into the Pine Ridge Sheriff's office would be the most dangerous thing Jake had ever attempted. But it might also be the only way to ensure that Henry's death hadn't been in vain, and that Coleman's reign of terror would finally come to an end. Jake found Henry's final cache key hidden inside the cabin's stone chimney, exactly where his uncle's last letter had indicated it would be. The key was unlike anything Jake had expected. Not a simple metal tool, but an intricate puzzle box, carved from mountain mahogany and inlaid with symbols that matched those in Henry's coded journal. It took Jake most of the evening to work out the sequence needed to open the box, cross-referencing symbols with entries from Henry's records and trying different combinations until the internal mechanism finally clicked. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk, was a brass key unlike any Jake had seen before. Its shaft was hollow, and when he looked closely, he could see a rolled paper hidden inside. The paper was a map, but not of any territory Jake recognized from his explorations. This showed underground passages marked with precise measurements and compass bearings. At the center of the mapped area was a symbol Jake had seen before, the star inside a circle that marked Henry's most important sites. But this wasn't just another mining location. According to the notations on the map, this was Henry's primary vault, a natural cave system that he'd expanded and fortified to store the bulk of his accumulated wealth. The key opened multiple locks, protecting a treasure that represented decades of careful prospecting and methodical accumulation. Jake studied the map by lamplight, memorizing every detail. The vault's entrance was concealed behind what looked like a natural rockfall in a canyon about 5 miles northeast of the cabin. Henry had built multiple layers of security around it: false entrances, booby traps, and camouflaged barriers that would fool casual searchers while protecting the real treasure from discovery. But more importantly, Henry had also stored his complete documentation there: original mining claims, territorial correspondence, geological surveys, and detailed evidence of Coleman's criminal activities. Everything Jake needed to bring down the conspiracy, protected in a location that even Coleman's people hadn't discovered. The problem was getting there alive. Jake spent the pre-dawn hours preparing for what might be his final expedition. He cleaned and loaded all his weapons, packed supplies for an extended journey, and wrote out copies of the most crucial information from Henry's journals. If something happened to him, he wanted to leave a trail that Martha could follow to expose the truth. As the first gray light touched the mountain peaks, Jake heard the ravens beginning their warning calls. Multiple groups of riders were approaching the cabin from different directions, moving with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Coleman wasn't taking any chances this time. He'd brought enough men to overwhelm any resistance. Jake slipped out through Henry's concealed exit and worked his way to a vantage point where he could observe without being seen. What he saw made his blood run cold. Coleman had assembled at least 20 men, including his regular deputies, Morrison's ranch hands, and several groups of professional gunmen. They'd surrounded the cabin during the night, positioning themselves to prevent any escape. But they'd also brought equipment that spoke of serious intent: ropes, shovels, and surveying instruments. This wasn't just an assassination squad. It was a mining operation, prepared to strip out Henry's gold deposits immediately after eliminating the last obstacle to their plans. Jake watched Coleman deploy his forces with professional efficiency. Guards on all the trails, marksmen positioned to cover the cabin's approaches, and search teams ready to begin systematic exploration of Henry's mining sites. The sheriff had planned this operation carefully, intending to solve all his problems in a single coordinated strike. From his hiding place, Jake could hear Coleman addressing his men, explaining their objectives with the calm authority of someone who'd done this before. The target is armed and dangerous, with extensive knowledge of the terrain. He's already killed 3 good men, so nobody takes unnecessary risks. We contain him first, then eliminate him cleanly. After that, we begin extraction operations at the marked sites. One of Morrison's men raised his hand. What if he tries to surrender? Coleman's laugh was cold and humorless. There won't be any surrender. This man knows too much about our operations to be allowed to live. But we make it look like an accident, maybe a rock slide or a fall from a cliff. Clean and simple. Jake felt a moment of grim satisfaction. Coleman was finally showing his true colors, abandoning any pretense of legal authority. But that also meant Jake was facing men who had nothing to lose and no scruples about how they achieved their objectives. Moving carefully to avoid the sentries Coleman had posted, Jake began working his way toward the canyon where Henry had hidden his primary vault. If he could reach it before Coleman's search teams found him, he'd have access to weapons, supplies, and documentation that could change the entire situation. But the journey required crossing terrain that Coleman's men were already beginning to search. Jake had to use every skill Henry's journals had taught him, moving like smoke through country that would expose a careless man to immediate discovery. The first close call came when Jake nearly walked into a search team examining one of Henry's secondary mining sites. 2 men with rifles were systematically checking every possible hiding place, working their way up a ravine that Jake needed to cross to reach the canyon. Jake waited in cover for nearly an hour before the searchers moved on, then crossed the ravine in a series of quick dashes that took him from one concealed position to another. But he could hear other teams working their way through the area, calling to each other as they coordinated their search pattern. The second near miss happened when Jake was following a game trail along a ridge line and spotted movement ahead. One of Coleman's marksmen had positioned himself on an outcropping that commanded a clear view of the surrounding terrain. The man was patient and professional, scanning methodically with field glasses and maintaining perfect stillness. Jake studied the situation for several minutes before finding a route that would take him around the sniper's position without exposing himself to observation. But the detour cost him precious time, and he could hear the search teams getting closer to the canyon. The final approach to Henry's vault required crossing an open slope that offered no concealment from observers. Jake waited until clouds obscured the afternoon sun, then made his move, using every fold in the terrain to minimize his exposure. Behind him, he could hear shouts as Coleman's men discovered his tracks and began converging on his general location. Jake reached the canyon entrance just as the first pursuit team crested the ridge behind him. He dove into the concealment of the rockfall that hid Henry's vault, hearing bullets crack against stone as Coleman's men opened fire on his last known position. But Jake was already working with Henry's key, following the map's precise instructions. To locate the vault's hidden entrance, The mechanism was more complex than he'd expected, multiple locks requiring the key to be turned in specific sequences, combined with hidden levers that had to be operated in the correct order. Behind him, Jake could hear Coleman's men spreading out to surround the canyon, shouting orders as they coordinated their attack. They knew they had him trapped, and they were taking their time to ensure there would be no escape. Jake finally felt the last lock click open, and a section of the rockfall swung inward on concealed hinges. He slipped through the opening, just as the first of Coleman's men appeared at the canyon rim, and found himself in a chamber that took his breath away. Henry's vault was a natural cave that had been carefully modified and expanded over years of patient work. The walls were lined with shelves carved from living rock, and those shelves held more gold than Jake had ever imagined. Nuggets sorted by size and purity, refined dust measured into precise portions, and raw ore samples from dozens of different sites. But more importantly, the vault also contained Henry's complete records. Document cases lined one wall, filled with correspondence, legal papers, geological surveys, and detailed evidence of Coleman's criminal conspiracy. Everything Jake needed to destroy his enemies was here, protected by tons of rock and accessible only to someone who knew Henry's secrets. Jake heard explosions echoing from the canyon entrance. Coleman's men were using dynamite to blast through the rockfall, trying to break into the vault by brute force. But Henry had planned for that possibility too. The vault had multiple exits, including a passage that led to the underground creek system that ran beneath the mountains. Jake gathered the most crucial documents and as much gold as he could carry, then activated the final element of Henry's defenses. Hidden charges that Henry had placed throughout the vault would collapse the main chamber if triggered, burying the remaining treasure and evidence where Coleman's people could never find it. But Jake wasn't ready to destroy everything yet. First, he had one more score to settle. Using Henry's escape tunnel, Jake made his way through the underground passages until he emerged from a concealed exit nearly a mile from the canyon. Behind him, he could hear the continuing explosions as Coleman's men tried to blast their way into the empty vault. By the time they realized their quarry had escaped, Jake would be well on his way to Pine Ridge with enough evidence to bring down the entire conspiracy. But before he headed to Denver to contact federal authorities, he had a promise to keep to his murdered uncle. Coleman had killed Henry and planned to steal everything the old prospector had worked for. Now it was time for the sheriff to discover that some debts could only be paid in blood. Jake reached Pine Ridge just as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the town in shades of gold and crimson that seemed appropriate for what was about to unfold. He'd spent the afternoon preparing for this confrontation, not just with weapons and strategy, but with Henry's testament, the legal document that would expose Coleman's conspiracy and protect Jake's claim to his uncle's legacy. The testament was more than just another piece of Henry's careful documentation. It was a complete confession, written in his uncle's careful hand and witnessed by a territorial judge during one of Henry's trips to Denver. In it, Henry detailed his partnership with Coleman, the sheriff's real identity, and the extent of the criminal conspiracy that had been operating throughout the Colorado Territory. But more importantly, the testament included a detailed account of Coleman's threats against Henry's life, along with evidence that Henry had provided to federal authorities weeks before his death. If anything happened to Henry, federal marshals were already prepared to investigate, armed with enough evidence to bring charges against everyone involved in the conspiracy. Coleman didn't know the testament existed, which gave Jake a crucial advantage in the confrontation that was coming. Jake approached the town carefully, using back alleys and abandoned buildings to avoid the main street where Coleman's remaining men might be watching. The sheriff's office sat at the corner of Main and Cedar Streets, a solid stone building that had been constructed to withstand both weather and trouble. But Henry's notes had revealed its weaknesses, back entrances, blind spots, and structural details that only someone who'd worked with Coleman would know. Through the office windows, Jake could see Coleman and Morrison in heated discussion, their voices carrying clearly in the still evening air. Both men looked frustrated and angry, which suggested they'd discovered Jake's escape from the canyon trap. "Told you he was more dangerous than he looked," Morrison was saying. "Now he's disappeared completely, and we've got 20 men standing around with nothing to show for it." Coleman's response was cold and controlled. "He can't have gone far. The canyon only has one exit, and we had it covered. Maybe he's better at this mountain man business than we thought, or maybe he had help we didn't know about." Coleman moved to the window, scanning the street with the careful attention of a man who sensed trouble approaching. "Either way, we need to find him before he reaches Denver with whatever evidence he's collected." Jake smiled grimly. Coleman's instincts were good, but not good enough to save him from what was coming. Moving with the silent precision of a hunter, stalking dangerous prey, Jake positioned himself outside the office's back entrance. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see both men clearly, along with 2 deputies who were cleaning weapons at a table near the front door. Jake drew Henry's testament from his coat and checked the other documents he'd gathered. Mining claims, correspondence with federal authorities, and detailed evidence of Coleman's crimes. Everything Henry had died to protect was here, ready to serve as both weapon and shield in the confrontation ahead. The plan was simple, but risky. Jake would enter through the back door, confront Coleman with the evidence, and force the sheriff to surrender to federal authorities who were already on their way to Pine Ridge. If Coleman refused, and Jake expected he would, then the matter would be settled the way such things were settled in the mountains, with courage and skill determining who walked away. Jake tested the back door and found it unlocked, which was either carelessness or overconfidence on Coleman's part. Either way, it gave Jake the opening he needed. He slipped into the office's back room, moving through shadows toward the main chamber, where Coleman and Morrison were still arguing. The 2 deputies were focused on their weapons maintenance, giving Jake precious seconds to position himself where he could control the situation. "Gentlemen," Jake said quietly, stepping into the lamplight with his rifle trained on Coleman, "I believe we have some business to discuss." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Morrison spun around with a strangled curse, reaching for his sidearm, before freezing when he saw Jake's rifle centered on his chest. The deputies started to rise from their chairs, but Jake's voice stopped them cold. "I wouldn't recommend sudden movements. I've had a long day, and I'm not feeling particularly patient." Coleman turned slowly, his hand resting casually near his gun, but not quite touching it. His face showed no surprise, just the calculating assessment of a professional facing an unexpected but not insurmountable problem. "Mr. Hartwell, I was wondering when you'd turn up. Thought you might have taken the hint and left the territory." "Can't do that, Sheriff. Seems I've inherited more than just a cabin and 40 acres. I've inherited a responsibility to see justice done for my uncle's murder." Coleman's expression didn't change, but Jake caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant the sheriff was preparing to make his move. "That's a serious accusation. I hope you've got evidence to back it up." Jake smiled and reached into his coat, producing Henry's testament. "As a matter of fact, I do." The moment Jake produced Henry's testament, Coleman's carefully maintained facade cracked. The sheriff's eyes went wide with recognition, and Jake saw the exact instant when Coleman realized his conspiracy had been exposed from the very beginning. "That's impossible," Coleman breathed. "Henry never had time to what? Document your partnership? Record your real identity? Provide evidence to federal authorities?" Jake kept his rifle steady while reaching for additional papers. "Uncle Henry was more careful than you gave him credit for, Coleman. Or should I call you by one of your other names?" Morrison stepped sideways, trying to get clear of the line of fire, but Jake tracked him with the rifle's muzzle. "Stay put, Morrison. You're part of this conversation, too." "I don't know what you're talking about," Morrison protested. "Coleman and I are legitimate businessmen." "Shut up, you fool," Coleman snarled. His composure had finally broken, revealing the cold killer beneath the sheriff's badge. "He knows everything. Jake pulled out the collection of Coleman's previous identities, letting the badges catch the lamplight. 7 different counties, Coleman. 7 different names. How many good men did you murder before you came to Pine Ridge? One of the deputies started to reach for his weapon, but Jake's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Don't do it, son. You're not part of the real conspiracy, just hired help who doesn't know what he's gotten into. Walk away now, and you might live to see tomorrow. The deputy hesitated, looking between Jake and Coleman with the uncertainty of a man realizing he'd been lied to about everything. He's bluffing, Coleman said, but his voice lacked conviction. Federal authorities don't care about a few mining disputes in the back country. Jake smiled grimly and produced the final document, the federal warrant that Martha's nephew had helped Henry obtain. Actually, they care quite a bit about territorial officials who've been systematically looting mining districts and murdering witnesses. Federal Marshal David Caldwell is about an hour behind me, along with a full company of territorial rangers. The blood drained from Coleman's face. Martha Caldwell's nephew is Federal Marshal David Caldwell, yes. Seems Martha kept better track of your activities than you realized. Every suspicious death, every forced land sale, every mysterious fire, all documented and reported to federal authorities in Denver. Morrison backed toward the door, his face pale with the realization that he'd been manipulated by a career criminal. Coleman, you told me this was legitimate business. You said we were developing mining claims legally. I told you what you needed to hear to make you useful, Coleman snarled. Just like I told everyone else in this worthless town. The admission hit Morrison like a physical blow. Jake could see the rancher's worldview crumbling as he understood how completely he'd been deceived. The cattle rustling charges you threatened me with? Morrison said slowly. The evidence you claim to have against my ranch operations, all fabricated, but useful for keeping you in line. Coleman's mask had fallen away completely now, revealing the predator who'd been hiding behind a badge. You were never a partner. Morrison, you were just another mark, too stupid to realize you were being used. The sound of approaching horses carried through the night air, multiple riders moving fast toward town. Jake smiled as he recognized the disciplined cadence of federal cavalry. That'll be Marshal Caldwell and his rangers, Jake said. Right on time. Coleman's hand inched toward his gun, desperation replacing calculation in his eyes. You think this is over? I've got contacts in Denver, people who will make sure this all disappears. Had contacts, Jake corrected. Past tense. Henry's testament includes names, dates, and financial records that trace the conspiracy all the way to territorial headquarters. Your partners in Denver are probably being arrested right about now. The front door burst open as federal rangers swarmed into the office, their weapons trained on Coleman and his deputies. Marshal David Caldwell entered behind them, a tall man with Martha's kind eyes and a badge that carried real authority. Sheriff Coleman, Caldwell said formally, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, fraud, and violation of federal mining laws. Deputies, you can surrender your weapons and submit to questioning, or you can be charged as accessories to murder. Both deputies dropped their guns immediately, raising their hands in surrender. They'd been hired as local law enforcement, not professional killers, and the sight of federal badges changed their perspective dramatically. Coleman made his move then, drawing his revolver with the practiced speed of a man who'd killed many in times before, but Jake had been expecting it, reading the desperation in the sheriff's eyes and the subtle shift in his stance that telegraphed violent intent. Jake's rifle spoke once, the heavy slug taking Coleman's center mass and spinning him around before he could bring his weapon to bear. The corrupt sheriff crashed into his desk, scattering papers and knocking over the oil lamp. Flames began to spread across the scattered documents as Coleman slumped to the floor. Get that fire out, Marshal Caldwell ordered his rangers, then knelt beside Coleman to check his condition. The sheriff was still breathing, but badly wounded and unconscious. Morrison stood frozen in the corner, his hands raised and his face reflecting the complete collapse of everything he'd believed about his life for the past 5 years. "Marshal," Morrison said quietly, "I want to cooperate fully. I was deceived about Coleman's real activities, but I won't pretend I'm completely innocent. I did things—" "We'll sort all that out later," Caldwell replied. "Right now, I need to secure the evidence and make sure Coleman's network is completely shut down." Jake handed over Henry's testament and the collection of documents he'd gathered, watching as Caldwell examined them with the trained eye of a federal investigator. "This is extraordinary work," Caldwell said after several minutes. "Your uncle documented everything with the precision of a professional prosecutor. We'll be able to roll up the entire conspiracy based on this evidence. What about the gold? Deposits, Henry's mining claims, all legitimate and properly filed. Your uncle made sure everything was legal before he tried to end his partnership with Coleman. The Territorial Mining Office in Denver has been holding sealed copies of his claims for over a year." Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Henry's legacy was secure, protected by law and backed by federal authority. Outside, the sounds of Marshal Caldwell's operation continued as rangers rounded up Coleman's remaining men and secured the evidence from the sheriff's office. The conspiracy that had terrorized Pine Ridge for years was finally coming to an end. "There's one more thing," Jake said, producing the key to Henry's primary vault. "Uncle Henry left detailed maps of his mining operations. Everything Coleman was trying to steal is documented and protected." Caldwell took the key and nodded gravely. "We'll need to examine those sites as part of our investigation. The territorial government wants to make sure this kind of systematic theft never happens again." As dawn broke over Pine Ridge, Jake stood on the sheriff's office porch and watched the sun rise over mountains that no longer held the threat of armed enemies. Coleman was under federal guard in the town's doctor's office. His surviving men were in custody, and Morrison was cooperating fully with the investigation. The nightmare that had begun with Henry's death was finally over. 6 months after the confrontation in Sheriff Coleman's office, Jake stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin and surveyed the transformation that had taken place in both the property and his life. The ramshackle structure that had drawn mockery from Pine Ridge's residents had been replaced by a solid, well-crafted home that reflected both mountain practicality and the prosperity that Henry's legacy had provided. But the changes went far deeper than mere construction. Jake had discovered Henry's full legacy map during the federal investigation, a comprehensive document that revealed the true extent of his uncle's discoveries. The gold deposits scattered throughout the mountains represented not just individual claims, but a carefully planned mining operation that could provide steady income for decades. Working with territorial mining engineers and federal inspectors, Jake had established the Hartwell Mining Company as a legitimate operation that employed nearly 30 men from Pine Ridge and surrounding communities. The same people who had once laughed at his inheritance now depended on it for their livelihoods, and Jake had found a purpose that went far beyond simply claiming his uncle's wealth. Martha Caldwell approached from the direction of town, riding in the buckboard that had become a familiar sight on the trail to Jake's property. Over the months since Coleman's arrest, she had become more than just an ally. She had become the partner Jake had never expected to find in the Colorado wilderness. "The latest assay reports came in from Denver," Martha said as she climbed down from the wagon. "The engineers think the northern vein might be even richer than Henry originally estimated." Jake helped her unload supplies from the wagon, noting the careful efficiency that characterized everything about Martha's approach to their shared venture. She had proven to be as skilled at managing the business aspects of mining as Jake was at the practical work of extraction and safety. "Any word from Marshal Caldwell about the trial proceedings?" "Coleman pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. He'll spend the rest of his life in federal prison, along with his contacts in the territorial government. Morrison's cooperation earned him a lighter sentence, 5 years, with the possibility of parole if he continues to provide testimony against the remaining conspirators. Jake nodded, feeling the satisfaction of justice served rather than vengeance taken. Coleman's reign of terror was over, and the evidence Henry had so carefully gathered had prevented other mining districts from suffering similar exploitation. They walked together toward the cabin, where Jake had prepared dinner using skills learned during decades of bachelor living in the mountains. It was a simple meal, but prepared with care and seasoned with the contentment that came from honest work and genuine companionship. "I've been thinking about Henry's letters," Martha said as they settled at the table. "The ones where he talked about legacy and what a man leaves behind when he's gone." "He left more than he knew," Jake replied. "Not just the gold, but a way of doing things right. Taking time to understand what you're dealing with, preparing for challenges, protecting what matters." "He also left us each other," Martha said quietly. "I don't think that was an accident." Jake had come to the same conclusion over the past months. Henry's careful documentation had included detailed observations about both Jake and Martha, along with suggestions that they would work well together as partners in both business and life. The old prospector had been planning more than just the transfer of his mining claims. He had been arranging for the people he cared about to find the happiness that had eluded his own solitary existence. "The territorial governor wants to establish a mining school in Pine Ridge," Martha continued, "using our operation as a model for how extraction can be done safely and profitably while respecting both the law and the community. What do you think about that?" "I think Henry would approve. He always believed in doing things the right way, even when it was harder than taking shortcuts." Jake looked around the cabin's main room, noting the careful details that reflected both Henry's practical wisdom and his own growing sense of permanence. Books lined shelves built from local timber. Maps covered one wall, showing the extent of their mining operations, and photographs documented the transformation of both the property and the community. On the mantel above the fireplace sat Henry's original journal, open to the page where he had written about the importance of patience and preparation in mountain living. Below it, Jake had placed a new photograph showing the Hartwell Mining Company's employees, men who had stable work because Henry had been willing to plan for the future rather than just grab immediate profits. "There's something else," Martha said, reaching into her bag to produce an official-looking document. "This came from the Territorial Land Office today." Jake examined the papers and found himself looking at a deed transfer that expanded his property to include all the mineral rights Henry had secretly surveyed and claimed. The 40 acres mentioned in the original will had been just the beginning. Jake now owned legal title to over 600 acres of proven gold-bearing terrain. "The federal investigation turned up Henry's complete survey records," Martha explained. "Everything he mapped and claimed over 25 years of prospecting. It's all legally yours now, with clear title backed by territorial authority." Jake set down the deed and walked to the window, looking out at mountains that now represented not just home, but responsibility for an entire community's future. He thought about the men working the mines, the families who depended on steady wages, and the legacy Henry had entrusted to his care. "You know what this means?" Jake said finally. "It means you're one of the wealthiest men in the Colorado Territory. It means we have the resources to do more than just extract gold. We can build something that lasts, something that helps people instead of exploiting them." Martha joined him at the window, and together they watched the sun set behind peaks that had witnessed both tragedy and triumph, corruption and justice, solitary struggle and shared success. "Henry would be proud," she said. Jake nodded, understanding finally that his uncle's greatest gift hadn't been the gold hidden in the mountains, but the example of how a man could live with integrity, even in a world where shortcuts and quick profits tempted everyone toward corruption. The mountain man, who had been laughed at for inheriting a worthless cabin, had discovered something more valuable than gold: the knowledge that sometimes patience Preparation and principle were the only tools needed to build a legacy worth leaving behind. As stars appeared over the Colorado peaks, Jake and Martha began planning not just for the next day's work, but for the years ahead, when the Hartwell Mining Company would serve as an example of how prosperity and principle could work together to build something lasting in the American West.